Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back with another subgenre deep dive, this time talking about the psychological thriller, very appropriate for October. And these psychological thrillers are increasingly popular today, and I think a reason for that is simply an increased focus on psychology in our society, a focus on trying to understand and explore why things happen and how people react to certain situations. And there are many types of psychological thrillers out there, many of them a little dark, a little spooky. There are other like non-mystery ones out there. And there are no spoilers in this video, but before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And join in the Discord if you haven't already. Link in the description. There are a lot of fun conversations going on the Discord, and the YouTube's comments have been acting up a bit lately, so I'm not actually able to respond to some of your comments for whatever reason right now. I promise I'm not ignoring you. And also this month I'm doing a 31 days of fright short stories where each day I post on the dashboard a different spooky short story to read every day until Halloween. So make sure you check out the dashboard every day. So, what is a psychological thriller? Well, as I mentioned in my adventure thriller video, one of you commented that a traditional mystery focuses on what happened in the past, while a thriller focuses on what is going to happen in the future. And that is true with the psychological thriller as well. These are focused on the anticipation of future events and what horror might occur. Now, I think a more like pithy way of differentiating a psychological thriller from an adventure thriller is that an adventure thriller is when the body goes on the experience and is taken for a ride. In a psychological thriller, it is the mind that is being taken for the ride. The mind is the one being toyed with and probably tortured, let's be honest. The psychological thriller is all about reactions to events, fear being the most common, but there are others. And I think there's a fine line between a psychological thriller and a horror novel, especially when discussing mysteries. You can certainly have both in a non mystery, but in a true mystery novel that is a psychological thriller, I do think the horror elements must be limited because you can't use the supernatural, I mean, the real supernatural, which tend to go hand in hand with horror. Certainly, psychological thrillers might have supernatural elements to it, but of course, because they have to play by the rules of detective fiction, the supernatural can't be real. And I would argue the fear, again, probably the most suspenseful, actually more suspenseful than like actual fright or horror. It's the Alfred Hitchcock idea that nothing is scarier than the unopened door. Like, you don't see the slashing, you see the result of it. Now, let's get into some characteristics of a psychological thriller. I'm going to talk about And Then There Were None here. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'm going to use that a lot in this video because, I expect most of you are familiar with that novel, so it's just easier for me to provide examples I think you'll understand. And I'll talk about others later on, but I think one of the key characteristics of a psychological thriller is that you very often don't have a detective force trying to solve what's going on. And if you do, it's usually either just like perfunctory or like very minor occurrences because this kind of thriller isn't necessarily focused on the solution. You will get a solution and it needs to follow the rules of detective fiction, but the story is usually more focused on the effects of the events on the characters and not so preoccupied with cluing and things like that. Obfuscation is very big. Often our culprit will be using fear as a distraction. Look at it, and then there were none. There is no detective on the island trying to solve things. Occasionally, some character might like throw out an idea or a suggestion, but no one is really trying to solve who UN Owen is. Maybe the reader is, but I also think these are maybe just best left trying not to solve from the reader's perspective. And we can see the fright and the fear play out as the guests on Soldier Island are knocked off one by one, and the poem taunts them, and they come face to face with the horrid guilt of their pasts. That fear goes a long way in explaining the guests' irrational thinking and their making of suboptimal decisions. All of their vulnerabilities come from their psychological character, their own fears and shortcomings and faults, especially for like the remaining like five or so guests, four of whom are extremely like physically fit and able-bodied, but they cannot overpower their fears and the villain on the island. Psychological thrillers often make the reader consider what makes a villain. And in Then There Were None, who is the villain? Is it UN Owen, who forces terrible people to suffer the consequences of their actions, but also brutally murders them and takes things into his own hands? Or is it the people who did those terrible things and escaped earthly consequences, but are now racked with guilt and hunted down? I often find there are larger psychological questions being asked in these kinds of novels. What is good? What is evil? These thrillers put the reader through all kinds of mental exercises, and I think this is so fascinating because the reader may not be experiencing the fear and suspense the characters are because, the reader's life is not in danger. So the mind boggling is still going on for the readers and making them reconsider their own belief system and blurring the lines. Authors tend to convince their readers to love and adore characters who are just totally not good people. Tom Ripley from Patricia Highsmith, definitely on this list. The talented Mr. Ripley here is just like truly an awful person, yet he is the hero, and the reader is taking his side and wanting him to succeed. There are a lot of like anti heroes in psychological thrillers, and because a lot of these novels are sort of no holds barred, the reader usually does wind up supporting types of characters they wouldn't otherwise support because they need someone to latch onto, someone to root for and cheer on. Another very common element of psychological thriller mysteries is that characters often turn against each other. People who once trusted each other no longer do so. There is a lack of trust amongst the characters that is the product of panic and fear. Again, I take you to And Then There Were None, where this distrust means the people in the group cannot work together to stay alive, even when it is apparent certain people are not guilty, and the characters begin thinking just like really wild and illogical explanations for events. Very much like a horror movie where, you scream at the characters like, don't go in the dark basement in the middle of the night, there's a killer on the loose. In fact, a lot of people would consider Agatha Christie sort of the founder of the slasher, and Then There Were None the first slasher. I don't know if I would go that far, but some people do. But I very much am in agreement that these psychological thrillers are certainly a precursor to horror films. And I want to talk about some different kinds of psychological thrillers. I think the most obvious one is sort of actually not really what I mean by a psychological thriller, but again, they do really qualify. And that would be thrillers where the hero is a psychiatrist, like Alex Delaware by Jonathan Kellerman. Delaware is a forensic psychologist. He was a child psychologist at one point, and he views crimes from that perspective. The reason why I'm sort of iffy on these is that I think like a psychological thriller is more than just like a mystery that the detective solves using, personality and characteristics of a murderer. Otherwise, you have things like a murder is announced or The Hollow, being psychological thrillers, but they lack that thriller element. They lack the twisting of the mind, and I do think sometimes modern literary scholars and critics just sort of say something is a psychological thriller if the main lead is a psychiatrist here. I do think perhaps the definition of this is getting much broader than it should be. Now, with like Alex Delaware, he deals with some pretty dark subject matter, so I definitely think this is like borderline psychological thriller in the way I mean it. There's also The Memory Game by Nietzsche French, which is a pseudonym for a husband and wife duo. I think that one is definitely more solidly psychological thriller. The wife character in the novel goes to seek a psychiatrist because of what she's going through. I'm more in the camp that having a psychiatrist character is not really a psychological thriller. You need more than that. But I do wonder again if like editors and publishers are sort of demanding that sort of character nowadays because going to see a therapist for mental health issues is just like much more common now, and there's a lot of encouragement to go seek that kind of help. But to me, one is not needed in a psychological thriller. And also, personally, I just find like psychologist characters not that interesting. Again, they can be a little boring from my point of view, and I also think they're getting a bit overdone. And I think just one type of psychological thriller that really stands out to me is something I alluded to in a previous video, and that would be the inverted mystery. Now, not all inverted mysteries are psychological thrillers, but many of them are. Because we are told who the killer is, the suspense of an inverted mystery is now the effect of that murder on the killer and the other characters, and on the detective trying to solve it. Often they deal with the aftermath as the killer tries to navigate not being caught and dealing with the consequences of their actions. And I say consequences because there's almost never a chance it goes right, so there are no benefits. There are so rarely like reap the rewards of their crime. Things go horribly wrong, and the aftermath isn't what they predicted it would be. Or maybe an innocent person is accused and the real killer has to decide what to do. Or maybe somebody found out. Think something like A Dark Adapted Eye by Ruth Rendell slash Barbara Vine, where a murder is still affecting people decades later. Or, Mr. Priestley's Problem by Anthony Barclay, where two men trick a third into believing he committed a murder to study the effects that fake murder had on his mind. And all of these people get sucked in, and it turns into this like huge deal, and they keep going with this experiment. Or Strangers on a Train. Like the list goes on and on and on. So many excellent inverted mysteries are psychological thrillers, and that's the excitement of them, is this sort of mental journey the characters are going on rather than the physical one. We also have what I call like suspicion based psychological thrillers, or like also called like isn't anything happening. These are mysteries where it's unclear if there even is a mystery. Like This Is Your Novels, like Before the Fact by Anthony Barclay, which Hitchcock turned into the film Suspicion. In this novel, a woman thinks her husband is a murderer and trying to kill her and has killed other people, but she doesn't actually know that. And that's the suspense. Is her fears and thoughts, are they true? Is she correct? Is she exaggerating? Is she actually in any danger? Is she crazy and imagining things? Another really like iconic non-literary example here would be the film Gaslight, which is where we get the term gaslighting comes from, the act of tricking someone into thinking they're going insane, which in turn actually causes them to go insane. And this is also, again, like, is there anything actually happening? Is someone exaggerating? Is someone making it up? It's just really fascinating here. And I should say here, like 99% of the time, something is actually happening here. Again, I think like if nothing was happening, that does run the risk of being like a huge letdown. So again, very often something is happening. Now, is it what they thought, or is it something else? That's again another question here. These are just so fascinating, and I think a lot of people are just tuned in to like know something is happening. So I do think if like it was an exaggeration, and there are certainly films and books like that, though again, I think people again suspect something will be happening. And now for some of my thoughts on psychological thrillers, I actually find these really fascinating. Again, to me, more so than like any other genre, except maybe like a broader like who done it type category here. You never know what you're gonna get from these. These are so varied. You have ones that like with supernatural sort of elements, or really like quasi supernatural sort of elements. Again, you have your inverted, you have your is there anything happening? You have all these different kinds, and they're so fascinating. And I feel like many psychological thrillers feel unique. I so rarely feel like we're getting like the same thing, or I feel like, oh, I've read something like this before. They're just so different all the time and so fascinating, and they absorb like so many different kinds of people in different situations, in different countries, in different lifestyles. It's fascinating. And I think psychological thrillers also have very broad appeal today. Again, I think this is one genre getting more and more popular. I think it appeals again to a wide swath of people. Now, I would argue maybe this is a subgenre here that's being labeled a lot more than it should be. I've seen a lot of things called psychological thrillers that aren't really psychological thrillers, and maybe there are, or maybe there's like a smaller element of some mind twisting thing going on that's not really encompassing the whole novel. In that case, I would not say it's a psychological thriller. We also have, again, I mentioned like a book with a psychiatrist being called a psychological thriller because of that. And I've also noticed here lately with like film and TV, either original or adaptations of existing works, There seems to be like a concerted effort here to insert a lot of like psychological terror into things that don't really need them. I mean, just take like the Christie adaptations of late. They seem to be a lot darker than the text and really just for no reason. I mean, like the Sarah Phelps definitely, but even the other ones as well, where there's sort of like a mental tension going on and it's added in for suspense even though it's not really what's in the book. Like I do feel like this is something we don't need all the time. Like we don't need like in the Murder is Easy from a couple years ago. That adaptation had like these weird scenes with like Gordon Whitfield like cutting food in a disturbing way. It's like that was not necessary. I don't know why that was there. Again, that was there. Actually, I do know why it was there. It was there to cause like this like sort of tension in the in the mind about like, oh, how grotesque those eggs look when they're running. It's like, why is that there? We don't need that. So I do think perhaps psychological thrillers may need a bit of a reset here and a little bit of a cooling off period, just so we actually have like true psychological thrillers and the label doesn't lose all of its meaning. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about psychological thrillers, what some of your favorites are, what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. Next week, we have a review of a novel by an author I have not actually covered on this channel before, and that will be The Hollow Man by John Dixon Carr, starring Gideon Fell. And again, very appropriate here for Halloween. Very spooky, supernatural like murder mystery here. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.